What if I were to tell you that you could create an entire comic book using 0 dialogue and only 7 camera shots? If you're not that great at writing but you really want to make a comic book, then this video should have the answers that you need. When we talk about camera shots in comics, we're talking about panel composition. It's about where you're placing the viewer in the panel, and where you put them relative to what's going on in your comic will give off different emotions and different information. So let's start with the latter and talk about information with shot number 1. This shot is probably in every comic, TV show and movie ever made at least once. You've probably drawn establishing shots all the time and not realized it. But why are they needed? Well, like the title suggests, they're there to establish where we are. This shot doesn't need to hold a huge amount of information, it needs to hold relevant information. Like in this shot, the relevant information is that we're on a street and this house is where the scene is taking place because it's the most dominant in the shot. This is often the first panel that you'll see in the scene, and it's usually followed by shot number 2. I like to think of the wide shot in 2 ways. The first is it's kind of like the secondary establishing shot. Here we've got a kitchen and a woman sat at her table. Also, the phone is ringing. We're still establishing the scene with relevant information for the viewer. The second way of seeing the wide shot is to show size. Because the shot is wide, you can use it to show the relative size of characters or objects within your scene. If a character is relatively normal, then you'd put them next to normal sized things like a kitchen table, like we see here. This character looks like she's a normal size. But if she were a giant, we could scale her up and leave everything else normal to help sell that idea. Again, no dialogue needed. You wouldn't need a secondary character to come in and say, "Hey Goethe, you know how you're a giant?" Well, anyway, that's just needless exposition. Now for shot number 3, this is sometimes known as the dialogue shot, because the camera is close enough to see the face and body expressions of the character. Side note, remember that we talk with our hands quite a lot, so consider that when drawing out your dialogue scenes, especially when there's 0 dialogue to be read, like in our comic. We can see that she's talking on the phone, and judging from her facial expressions, she's talking to someone she knows or is just a happy character, or both. If we went for a wide shot here, then it would be more difficult to tell, which is why the medium shot is the preferred one to choose for this. Generally speaking, the more you zoom in on an object or a character, the more that object or character is rendered, like in shot number 4. The close-up consists almost entirely of the face, so all of our attention is on the expressions of our characters. You would expect to see more detail and information even if your style is simplified. One way to think about the camera is that the closer it gets to our characters or objects, the more tension there is in the scene. Think of it like a volume dial. If in the medium shot the character is happy and you want to turn that happiness up, then you bring the camera closer. Likewise, if the character is happy in one panel but you want to change that up and make them not happy, then bringing the camera closer can help sell that switch in emotion, because the tension is going up. And when we want the tension to get really high, that's where we go to shot 5. If using a close-up is turning the volume up, then using the extreme close-up is turning the volume up to 11.
These go to 11.
This is where the tension is at its highest, and we tend to only focus on one element. In this case, the eyes, which is one of the most common shots for the extreme close-up. But it doesn't have to be. If the character is hearing something, you could focus in on the ears. You could also use lots of smaller panels to show more than one element at a time, and it doesn't have to be the character itself. Like here, we have an extreme close-up of her eyes and an extreme close-up of the tea, which she has dropped. So let's go through all these 5 shots. You should already know what's going on based purely on the visuals and the camera placement, but I'll narrate my way through anyway. We have the establishing shot showing us where we are. The secondary establishing shot shows us who our actors are, what room they're in, what's going on in the room, and by the looks of it, they appear normal. The medium shot shows her talking on the phone with either someone she recognizes or in a way that shows us she's a happy character. Close-up is our first bit of tension where her face no longer looks happy. Something has been said. And the 5th and final shot shows the tension ramped up. Her eyes are wide with shock, she's dropped her tea, something bad has happened, and all that with no dialogue. With these 5 shots, you can go on to make an entirely wordless comic. But I said 7, didn't I? Well, the final 2 aren't new shots, but they affect the previous 5 that we've talked about. And those 2 are all about angles. For the most part, we've been talking about slowly zooming the camera in towards our scene. But what if we were to tilt the camera? Well, I'm going to highlight 2 options that have equal and opposite effects on the panel and scene. The first is the high angle shot, which is used to make a character feel vulnerable, small, or isolated. You might see this shot used before a big impact, like when a Kamehameha wave is about to hit. We've all been there. And here, the high angle shot is selling vulnerability. And here, and here. The opposite side of the coin is the low angle shot, which is used to make things seem bigger and more dominant and aggressive. Even if a character isn't performing an aggressive act, by making use of this angle, we can sell the idea that they are dominant in nature, like with Negan in The Walking Dead. Or in this shot with Harley and Joker, we can see that Harley is the dominant one in this scenario, which is amplified by the angle of the camera. And Joker is dominant in this one. And for acts of aggression, this one is angled slightly so Earl looks larger and more dominant. Now for each of these 7 shots, the 5 at the start and the 2 angled variations, you have an infinite number of different options to use for your comic. The real secret is understanding why you would choose a particular shot for a particular panel to serve your story. And if you know why you're making those choices, then you can turn a good script into a great visual narrative. At the end of the day, it's your job as the comic artist to come up with the visuals that have the greatest impact on the story. And if this video helped, then be sure to subscribe because I talk about comics all the time. Check out my links in the description, and as always, have fun drawing.